minute left as we're transitioning to this next session. Thank you again, everyone, for being here today and for listening and taking the time to engage and learn and hear from all these amazing speakers throughout the day. Our next speaker is someone who I'm very honored to introduce, Dr. Jennifer Grenz, who has inspired a lot of the way that I think about invasive species and traditional ecological knowledge. And she's going to be talking to you today about removing the targets, giving relational consideration to invasive species by applying an Indigenous worldview.
Oops. Sorry, I'm just going to get my screen all ready to go here. All right. Hello, everyone. I cannot tell you how wonderful it is to be in this space with you. I spend so much of my time trying to convince people, in my field of invasive species management and in ecology, to be open to the idea of applying an Indigenous worldview to how we go about doing our science, in the Western scientific sense. And so it's amazing to have an audience where perhaps I don't need to be, leaning on people in that way, and get to share a little bit more of some of the exciting stuff that we're doing instead of sort of backtracking and convincing and things like this. So thank you for that. So allow me to just introduce myself quickly. My name's Jennifer Grenz. I am a proud Nlaka'pamux woman of mixed ancestry. My grandmother was Hester Robinson Swartz, and my great-grandmother is Amy Swartz Tracera. My family are members of the Lytton and Bonaparte First Nations in the interior of our province. So we have a very deep history, kind of all the way from Lillooet to Lytton in what's now referred to as British Columbia. I'm grateful to be speaking to you today from the lands of the Pentlich speaking people along the eastern shores of the Salish Sea in what is now referred to as Parksville. We live on a small farm with forest lands around us that we grow foods and medicines for friends and family members. So it's a wonderful place to live, and I commute back and forth to UBC. I'm a newly appointed assistant professor in the Department of Forest Resources Management in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, where I'm jointly appointed with the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. But before that, I have been an invasive species specialist in the province of British Columbia for almost 20 years. And so that last panel really spoke to my heart because I really view myself more as a practitioner that's kind of turned academic, but will always be a practitioner at heart. And that discussion really spoke to a lot of the things that I've experienced. It's very interesting to hear all of the similarities, on both sides of this arbitrary border that we have between us. So in the work that I've done with invasive species, I would like to assert that I arguably have one of the best jobs ever. I get to spend a lot of time in some really special places, trying to bring healing to our lands. And this is a very important piece of the journey of how I've gotten to where I am today. Because during my career, I've continued to quietly practice my culture as a plant knowledge holder in my community, growing and collecting medicines alongside my children, growing foods and medicines, as I mentioned, for my family and for friends. And this is a part of myself that I didn't really share very much. I really sort of have led two distinct lives. There's sort of scientist me and has been Indigenous me. And I, reflecting back, realized that the reasons for doing that were largely out of self-protection, but also, that I did get, advice from well-meaning mentors that perhaps I should stay away from this Indigenous stuff because maybe I would undermine myself as a scientist. And I realized how terrible that sounds, but you know, those are the messages that we get told, and I do want to believe that that came, you know, from a place of care, no matter how wrong that actually is. But again, this is also a really important part of the journey of me, you know, beginning to give relational consideration, you know, to invasive species. So my career has not been limited to, you know, researching best management practices for invasive species and managing them, you know, firsthand, but also that I spent a lot of time working for environmental nonprofit organizations, which involved, you know, creating education and advocacy campaigns regarding invasive species, including some very highly successful campaigns like Alien Busters and Not on My Property, which is what this image here is from. So essentially, I've been serving up a heap of hyperbole for a very long time. And, you know, we did what we needed to do. When you're creating messaging around something that is as important as the impacts of invasive species, and many of them do have negative impacts to biodiversity, you know, we are trying to provide education as quickly as possible and break through, you know, people's busy lives, politicians that barely know about or even care about any of these issues. And so sometimes we have to go, you know, to great lengths to get their attention. And I think we've done a tremendously good job at, you know, alienating these species. And, you know, why shouldn't we? You know, we do have species that can alter hydrology, you know, threatening salmon habitats. This is along a river in the north shore of Vancouver. You know, and I spend a lot of time working on knotweed species, so you're going to see a lot of pictures about knotweed, but, you know, here's some more of the destruction, you know, that the species causes, and it really is probably one of the top priorities, you know, for our province. And for me, my greatest concern about the impacts of this species happens around fish, and I have spent quite a bit of time with colleagues in Washington State looking at approaches there, because our regulations are different in Canada. You know, we don't necessarily have all the management tools available to us. But all in all, I felt very comfortable, you know, serving what I believed to be my why, which is, you know, these guys right here. And this is the last big sockeye salmon run in 2014 on the Pitt River. So in addition to, you know, serving my why, I also care a lot about, you know, the health and safety of people. And so, you know, I'm dealing with a plant also that has significant threats to infrastructure, and a species that if you admire plants, you really should admire, because this one apparently can also grow in complete darkness and photosynthesize. So this was a site where it was covered by 3 layers of tarp and a foot of aggregate and started growing through. So, you know, as science me, or the more conventional science me, you know, enjoys a challenge, and this plant has certainly been that. And, you know, there are other species that we're managing that are a threat to human health, where, you know, how we consider them is really clear cut. This is giant hogweed. I'm sure many of you in the Pacific Northwest are very familiar with this species, you know, that can cause recurring 3rd-degree burns when exposed to sunlight for a period of up to a decade, can cause blindness. And poses that danger at any growth stage, you know, so whether we're talking about little germinates or we're actually talking about, you know, full-size 15-foot plants. So I've spent a lot of time working on that. So these, you know, these are the ones that are more clear cut. And, you know, I feel tremendously proud, you know, of the work that I have been part of to, you know, create pictures like this, right? This is one of my favorites, just because it's kind of fun. So. These are what I like to call the money shots, right? And also that we've been able to do, management of species, when they are right up with important, culturally important plants, and figuring out how to do selective treatments, such that we are eliminating non-target damage, as much as possible. So, these are all, things that I'm proud of. However, I would be lying if I told you that they all worked out like those pictures. In fact, that's rare. So often we act like we are very sure of ourselves when it comes to invasive species management, but it doesn't go that well. And there are places and species that I've been managing for more than a decade, almost 2 decades, where really it just feels like we're chasing our tails, and we're getting nowhere, and so here's, a picture of everyone's favorite Scotch broom. What do we do about situations like this? And, I've spent a lot of time in the news as well, talking about the impacts of invasive species, but really I have to say that change is needed in our field of study. We are inhibited by the lack of reception to other viewpoints. There is a culture attached to invasive species management where, it's almost like going against the dogma, of invasive species management to even hesitate for a moment or even to give that relational consideration to plants. And I do think that this is where, when advocacy gets tangled up with science, we start to have a problem, because we don't want to undermine our messaging, that we're telling, say, to politicians that are funding these programs. If you get into the gray zone, it becomes very confusing sometimes, and we can undermine ourselves. So I understand how we've gotten to this point, but I know that of all the times, of self-doubt that we're not making a difference, that we're unnecessarily putting herbicide out into the environment, that maybe, pollinators actually need some of these plants that we're seeing, we have to create a shift in the culture to be able to kind of say these things out loud and not risk, professional banishment, and I don't even think that that's an extreme way of describing, what I've seen to those of us that have, dared to kind of present maybe some other perspectives on what it is that we're doing. And I just wanted to share with you a personal story that is actually in my upcoming book, about, how we are so trained, and this has been touched on today by other presenters, to see in a certain way that such that we can't even see the other things. So this is called A Stranger in the Bush. I picked my way along, making my own path around the rocks and roots and ferns and shrubs and trees, on the hunt, the target set, fixated on the glowing red dot on my iPad map. I have done this long enough that little attention need be paid to my surroundings. I brought my best friend along to assist, her first time out on such a quest. As I moved swiftly, honing in on the bad plants whose demise were imminent, she kept asking me, "What's this?" pointing at the plants and trees. Ordinarily, such inefficiency would make me annoyed, but for some reason, her interest intrigued me. With my recent ponderings on worldviews, I realized that her point of view provided me with a rare opportunity. Ordinarily, I'm working with folks like me, who have spent most of their lives crawling around in the bush. It isn't so much that you take it for granted, but you just don't take it in anymore in its entirety. So I tried to patiently answer her questions, and then I realized I didn't know the answer to a lot of her questions. I looked around through her eyes. I finally saw all the plants, the shrubs, the trees, the mosses, the insects, the fungi. I felt like I needed to introduce myself to them. How is this possible? How did I not know many of them? And the ones that I did know felt mostly like acquaintances I had met in another context, but couldn't remember where. Later, I realized that we met while I put together orders of native plant lists for restoration projects. From the lists that I was provided by native plant nurseries, I had placed check marks next to their names. I had some old friends I could introduce her to, though. The berries I ate with my dad while we fished the rivers and creeks. Those were awkward introductions, though, as I couldn't remember their names. They were mostly typecast as edible or not. I felt as though my feet left the earth. Disoriented, quickened breath, I glanced down at my iPad and realized that the glowing red dot was within my crosshairs. I looked up. There they were, right where the sun broke through the canopy, the invasive knotweed plants. I breathed a sigh of relief. I felt grounded again. There you are, my enemies. Thank goodness. This only happened to me because seeds had been planted in myself to start applying a different worldview, to practice making the old new again. I'm so sorry. My son is coming home from school. I'm just going to mute for one moment. What are we missing by othering these species? What are we missing when we only view them in this way? It was becoming clear to me that our ecological restoration was dichotomously led. Native plants good, invasive plants bad. We were thinking about anything that didn't belong to get rid of, and then these plants that we seem to think belong to then plant them again. And that is largely in my work in environmental, with environmental nonprofits, that is largely how. I'm so sorry. This is real life. Okay. This is largely how we were conducting our work. But what are we missing when we're merely looking for targets? And in myself, I felt sort of a confusion, because as I was collecting medicines and making medicines with elders and other plant knowledge keepers, from Coast Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw communities that I frequently work with and are my very good friends, we were collecting plants that I had othered, that I had this sort of xenophobic approach to, right? Like right here, we have St. John's wort as an example. And then we were also, collecting plants that we had planted, calendula, lavender, right? So, and there was no difference in how we approached harvesting them and the respect that we gave to them. But meanwhile, in my everyday work, I wouldn't have even given them a second look. And I certainly would not have offered them, the respect that we did when we were harvesting them to make medicines. And, all the while, I just kept kind of pushing down these thoughts because the stakes were high for me. This book here, if you haven't read it before, I highly recommend Where Do Camels Belong? About the origin and stories of invasive species. I wanted to bring this author to speak at an invasive species conference in Vancouver, and I was told, no, he's too controversial, when all he's actually talking about is the truthful history of where species come from. But this is where this is what we're dealing with, basically, within my profession. And I'm not giving invasive species a free pass. I've shown you, the ones that are of particular concern. And it's so important that we allow ourselves, to have this conversation. I spent 15 years of my career, pointing out all of the flaws in invasive species. So this is incredibly, difficult for me. But the more I've allowed myself to give consideration to these species, the more I realize that our work sits firmly upon a lot of assumptions and what I refer to as invasive species lore, where we have these generalized principles of invasion biology that we apply to every species that we have decided to other. But if you go back in the scientific literature, you cannot find these specific impacts, say on biodiversity as an example. This is and it's actually, if you start to trace back citations, it becomes very interesting. And so, we just can't work with such certainty. And it's a certainty that comes with this impassioned rush to action, because there are species that we let get away on us that have caused considerable impacts. But we actually need, what I call the wisdom of the pause that I've learned from elders, in giving consideration about what it is that we're doing. And further to this, our climate is changing, and our people have survived changes in speciation, since time immemorial. And so, one of my criticisms of invasive species policy in particular is, are we inhibiting our food security and food sovereignty, by sort of hitting this colonial pause button on the ecosystem, not recognizing that these are dynamic systems that we have to stop trying to put back together and fight, where the climate is taking us right now. One example that I like to use is, by today's standards, in terms of how we do species assessment, Western red cedar would have been considered an invasive species 5,000 years ago. This is now our iconic species, our mother species of the Coast Salish people. So, what are we stopping ourselves from, getting that we may well need, in these species that show up? And so, again, in my nervousness of sort of bringing this onto the, stage of the invasive species world that I've been part of for so long, I recognize that perhaps the way to do it was through an Indigenous worldview. Many ecologists are starting to work towards integrating traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And so, I could see an opening there to begin this conversation, and, and that perhaps under this presentation of it, that people would not be threatened by it, and that this could actually allow them to have these conversations about working beyond a dichotomously guided, ecological restoration. Because the fact of the matter is that we don't have a choice. We have to start having the difficult conversations about changes in speciation, and the needs of all of our relations that rely on these landscapes, the two-legged and four-legged. The targeted worldview of invasive species management is holding us back. It's not serving us. So my hope is, that in starting to integrate Indigenous knowledge, that we can now apply this relational worldview, and adhere, to the relational accountability that comes with something like Indigenous research methodology. But when we look at things like the 3 R's, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, ask yourself, are we adhering to these 3 R's when we talk about invasive species? Well, we really aren't. We really aren't. We're certainly not giving them a lot of respect, and we're not even necessarily offering them any form of reciprocity, which could come from thinking about where they could work, in context. And then, what is our responsibility, to these species, as well as to the relations that have become reliant upon them, as they show up. And so, I spend a lot of time educating, Western trained scientists about differing worldviews, but I wanted to leave this in because I think that it's really important. We need another worldview that will provide us with the freedom to look at these issues differently, in spite of these cultures that discourage that. So I just ask people to play along with me with these. So I'm sure you're familiar with these images. So a lot goes into what you see first, and sometimes we can see sort of both images and maybe only see one. So I'm just going to fly through these slides here. So play along. So what's important to recognize is that what you saw first, or could see or couldn't see, nothing is right or wrong here, right? It's just that there's a lot that's going into what you saw, right? And one of the interesting things that happens is that, sometimes you can't see the other thing. Like this one in particular stumped me for a while. So donkey head and a seal laying on its stomach, okay? But once you're told what the other thing is that you maybe couldn't see at first, then you can see it. And then in your own mind, you can flip this image back and forth, right? Seal, donkey, seal, donkey. There is a tremendous power in being able to do that. And I encourage you to try this, when you're in the field, when you're out in your workplace, and what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. There's a site that I've been working on for 11 years now, and we've been having a lot of difficulty managing this knotweed site. And I just, instead of, immediately tackling it as we have for the last 10 years, which isn't working so great, stopped and started to see the site in its context, in what was around it, in what was growing with it. And then we changed our tack. We started to try and support the populations of plants that were in that site as well. And we started to play with the soil chemistry. And through that, actually started to, move closer to our goal of eradicating the plants. And had I not allowed myself to sort of see things differently, that went against all of my Western scientific training and years of experience, suddenly the old was new again, and we could take a different tack. And I had given myself that permission to do something different. And this is why, there's so much wisdom in the last panel too, like taking youth out with you on a site. I take my kids with me sometimes, because they actually have a better ability of seeing things a bit differently than I do, and drawing my attention to things that I won't see anymore, because my work has become as automatic as my autonomic nervous system sometimes. And, it would be a lie to say that this was easy for me. Even as an Indigenous woman, I am a Western trained scientist. I believe strongly in science. I have always felt like, it is helping us to understand the way the world works. Now I have come to, recognize through my own work, and through, my scholarly work now, that we need to break beyond the confines of a singular worldview and complete the picture. But for me, trying to approach a site and do research in ecology in a different way was one of the most difficult things that I have ever done in my life. I felt like I was undermining myself. I felt like everyone would judge me. I felt like I was failing my old mentors in some way. And then Peter Cole, who's a professor in education at UBC, wrote this poem to me exactly like this when I was sharing with him my struggles in using an Indigenous worldview and Indigenous research methodology. And he said, write in your own way, think in your own way, research in your own way. Don't think you have to ask permission. How long does that have to go on for? Quote your elders and your children and the wind, the waves, the clouds. They are always telling you stories, listening to your stories. And, for me, this was the lesson of permission. It wasn't about abandoning everything that I had been taught, because there's so much value in that, but it was in that allowing myself the space to apply a relational approach. And allow myself to observe and take in the environment in an entirely different way. And so for me, this completely transformed my research journey, as I was doing my PhD. It changed how I chose the research subject, right? Suddenly it became about community care and making a difference in the community. It wasn't about an independent scientific pursuit. It changed how I went about that research. So initially I started out, with my iPad and my GIS program and going through grids and, looking at vegetation plots, to actually just never bringing my iPad or a notebook on the site with me for the next 2 years. And I just moved from place to place and sat and observed and smelled and listened. And it's probably hard to conceive for most Western trained scientists that I learned more about how to bring healing to that space by doing that, by sitting and getting to know the dog walkers that came through the trails every day, and talking to those dog walkers and recognizing the value, not just in Indigenous knowledge, but local based knowledge for places, people that know these places, for years, for, so it really transformed my approaches. And I know that I can, I can never go back. I will always give species, relational consideration. And again, I just want to, reiterate that this isn't about giving, species a free pass. It's about taking a pause to think beyond these generalized impacts, figuring out how, and this is something we need to do work on, how do we introduce nuance into this conversation? How do we have these tough conversations? Who is informing the work that we're doing? What are we watching for? Is it really specific to place? How do our risk assessments look? Are we considering things like community needs and values? How does climate change roll into this or is considered within this? It's not just an automatic othering, right? You don't belong here, that's it, the end. It cannot be that way. That that is not how that is perpetuating colonialism in many ways. And so as I give relational consideration to plants, this is orange hawkweed. Orange hawkweed, does have an impact on browsing lands. It does create monocultures. But I pulled over at the side of the highway. I was doing work on northern Vancouver Island in Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And I couldn't help but notice the pollinators flying and buzzing about, because the orange hawkweed just goes for kilometers down the road. So we pulled over and I just took videos and pictures and I counted like 9 different species of pollinators, and our pollinators are struggling, and I don't know, like, is this pulling them away from, culturally important plants that need their pollination? I don't know, but something's happening there. And so it's probably irresponsible of me to just go in and spray it all and kill it all, because clearly there are relations that have become reliant upon it or are selecting for it. And maybe that should just change our research questions a little bit, and try to understand that, instead of just othering and getting rid of it. And the other thing that this does is it pushes us beyond the just killing it part, like all of those before and after pictures that I showed you. That's as far as our invasive plant program in British Columbia goes. It is about targeting something, getting rid of it, but never asking the and then what question, which is exactly what my lab at UBC is now focusing on, is the and then what question, right? And so now it's looking at, taking the time, like even within how we collect data, it was eradicated or not. That's it. That was the end. Now I have questions on there, my own questions, not from the provincial program, that are saying, is there evidence of the native seed bank coming back? What other plants are in there? What are we seeing? Are we seeing evidence of allelopathy from, what's the legacy of these plants, even though they're eradicated on the landscape? These are really important and specific questions to ask, because the other thing that I noticed is when I was doing work, with environmental nonprofit organizations, is that we would be quick to come in there like caped crusaders of the environment and plunk in the quote unquote native plants, only to have them die like right away. And we don't understand why. This, we were watering them, we were tending to them, but again, what is the legacy of these plants that we've eradicated on the landscape? And is that stopping us from really bringing healing to the land? And there were so many times where, I think I did pay a little more attention to the land perhaps than my colleagues did, and maybe is that because of my indigeneity and spending a lot of time with elders on the land? Probably. But, I was among one of the first people to make the observation that knotweed appeared to be creating, that it had viable seed, and that we were getting spread by seed, not just clonal growth. But everyone laughed at me for a few years until it was confirmed, in fact, by the scientists, because at that point I was a lowly practitioner, that yes, indeed, that was what was happening. And so I actually did some work on that seed ecophysiology of hybrid knotweed species. And, this also just illuminated to me that in this relational consideration that we're giving, we aren't even extending that even to the soils, you know. So this was in this restoration failures, and I started to work with some archaeologists, and you know, we were trying to reestablish a Garry Oak ecosystem with Cowichan tribes, and you know, we were in a sea of weeds. I could have taught a weed science course standing still, like the site was just so invaded. And then we were trying to reestablish Camas and Garry Oak, and they were just not doing well. And there's just more and more weeds. And we're like, what is going on? And then if you look at the feet of my friends there in that picture, you know, these are not soils that are typical, you know, to Garry Oak systems. You know, what we didn't in our lack of relational consideration, we dishonored the history of the land, even if the history is colonial. And what's at their feet is 100 years of a Garry Oak meadow on an ancient, you know, not ancient, but village site. I mean, it does go back to ancient times, a village site of the Cowichan people that was a dairy farm for like 100 years. So the soils are not the same, right? So we can't kind of take these approaches, you know, without giving this consideration to the whole picture. And that's what I really loved that the last panel was touching on. You know, and these other things too, where we have quote unquote native species that behave invasively, because we have work to do in being part of the ecosystem and shaping these systems. So here we have snowberry that's behaving invasively, and because we aren't using fire in these systems anymore, you know, the young Garry Oaks are having a very hard time working their way through this. And as much as I wanted to manage this system, I was held back by regulation, because our invasive plant program only manages invasive plants, not native plants. Right? So this is where we're just sort of losing the grander picture, you know, of what it is that we're trying to do. You know, and meanwhile, you know, again, we've got pollinators on spotted knapweed, and a real value, you know, food security is becoming a significant issue. I mean, it always has been, but now we have inflation, we have an affordability crisis. You know, free food is important. And so, you know, we've been leaving Himalayan blackberry that we used to tend to, you know, surrounding some different communities where community leadership has asked us to do that, you know. But then I find myself in the middle of a fight between the government, you know, and Indigenous communities that want these plants left there for food values. So, you know, it's very confusing, because especially, you know, highly disturbed urban sites, what is Himalayan blackberry really doing? You know, what else would grow in some of these places? You know, and I think the other thing too, when we're not giving relational consideration, is we're not thinking about, you know, when we target things, again, we're not thinking about what our grand vision is and what it is that we're trying to, you know, how we're supposed to bring healing and what our specific goals are. The goal, again, has to go beyond, you know, just eradicating a target. And this is my daughter collecting thimbleberry. And again, you know, these are plants that, you know, I started to kind of test, you know, some of the interns that were working in the invasive plant program that they couldn't even name. And these are the very plants that they, you know, are trying to protect, in my mind. But it just kind of shows you that that really has been lost. That isn't really what it's about anymore. And this relational consideration is, you know, changing my work as well. You know, we're working on an invasive grass at the north end of Cowichan Lake, you know, called Downy False Brome. It's the only site of it in British Columbia. And we were scouring, you know, a kind of a 10 square kilometer area, trying to figure it out for 3 years. And then again, this relational consideration, I was like, how are you moving? Like, I want to get to know you, grass. You know, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this in Braiding Sweetgrass, right? Instead of like treating what it is that we're doing like some sort of object, you know, I was like, hey, plant, like, how are you moving around here? Because scouring, all up and down the hills and, trying to find a needle in a haystack is really kind of crazy making and isn't really, doing us any favors. And then we started to watch the Roosevelt elk in the area and realized that the plants were all where the elk were, up their trails, in their bedding down areas, and very few other places, and within a very specific area, around a very specific time of year that they were in that area, which then actually significantly reduced the amount of work that we're doing. And now we're asking more questions. What is the relationship between the elk and this grass? Not just like, oh yeah, of course they're a vector for spread. No, more specific than that. What are the conditions being created that are actually allowing this grass to thrive, because maybe this will better inform our management. And I realize I'm coming to the end here, so I'm going to kind of move through a little bit more quickly, but I've started to call this our Indigenous ecology. So this is relationally guided healing of our lands, waters, and relations, which brings a desired balance to an ecosystem while respecting and honoring our mutual dependence through reciprocity. And this, there are a number of stories, Kwakwaka'wakw and Coast Salish stories, that talk about humans fulfilling their role as balancers of the ecosystem, that we are not outside of the pot sort of throwing ingredients in and watching what happens, but we are actually in it. And that we have to make really difficult decisions about how we are purposefully shaping our lands and waters to provide foods, medicine, technology for our communities, and also what our responsibilities are to our other relations in that system. And so in making these decisions, this is where we can work with a greater degree of specificity in each of the areas that we're managing, right? So it's not that Himalayan blackberry is bad, the end, it doesn't belong here. It's instead saying, what value, what does the community need right now? And is this the right place for this plant? And how can we continue to manage it in this place in a way that then maybe we don't experience some of the negative impacts that we don't want? And it's perfectly okay for us, to have that kind of nuance, in the work that we do. And in just wrapping up, I started out with this, it seems so silly now, as my research question with my PhD. What do Indigenous knowledge holders think about invasive species? And instead, in embracing Indigenous research methodology and being on the land in a different way, this was like the least significant question that was answered, but I will tell you what I learned. And that is that on this, what I call the spectrum of invasive species philosophy, which is this xenophobic, all plants that don't belong here should be killed, all the way to the other camp that I don't necessarily belong to, which is live and let live. Okay. The answer to this question, there was no clear, neat, and tidy answer. It depended. It depended on the species. It depended on the place. There was a beautiful dynamic fluidity to the answer of this question. This is my friend Luce Cheam, who's an elder couch and tribes Dr. Arvid Charlie. And, we just talked so much about these colonial notions of who we are as Indigenous people, as though we didn't travel and we didn't move plants and fertilized fish eggs and clams and people all over the landscape. My own family has so many stories of traveling to Mexico, so, of course plants were moving, so this colonial notion of nature, being specific and perfect and not with human intervention, it's just, that is just not the way it was. And that was reflected in the answer to this question. And so, while I might look at something like this with complete and utter horror, meanwhile, Luce Cheam is telling me, for the first time, any of us at least had heard of stories of the medicinal benefits of Scotch broom. He told the story about people getting burns on their skin from working in strawberry fields. in Washington State, actually, and using Scotch broom to tend to their burns. It was the first time I'd ever heard a story that was positive about Scotch broom. So I think that it's amazing to live in a space where we can have nuance and find new medicines and not limit our knowledge. I've heard other people today talk about, we are here now. Indigenous knowledge is not limited to the past. And so we don't want to stop ourselves from learning about new, important medicines as we face a changing climate and maybe lose some of the other ones that we've become reliant upon. We want to be able to continue to have the skills to, be so connected with land that we can see, new invitations for new relationships, from these plants. And meanwhile, on the other side, continue to shape our lands and waters as Creator has told us to, which is, in this case, UBC Farm, we needed this Himalayan blackberry gone because we had other biodiversity goals in terms of hedgerows on the farm. And that's perfectly okay. Both are okay. Collecting narrow-leafed plantain along with equisetum, like, wonderful. And so just to sum up, this is about, removing the target, and we need to change the terminology of how we talk about ecological restoration, moving away from these transactional, impersonal terminologies, talking about land healing, not calling, species invasive, but I just say relationally preferred species. What do we prefer in this space? Because the language that we use really matters. And creating a story for the spaces that we are bringing healing to, is so important in allowing us to have this nuance. And so, this is my last slide. This is about completing the puzzle. This is not about throwing science away, because science has a very important role to play in completing the picture as well. It's just, we cannot restrict ourselves to this singular worldview. And I think invasive species provide an excellent example of that. So, a project I'm working on right now on wildfire recovery in the Lillooet area, we had horrific wildfires, as you did last summer, is instead of, just like, what is the vegetation trajectory of native and invasive plants, in these burn areas, we're going to the places that are culturally important, to Lillooet Tribal Council, so where are the bedding down areas for the mule deer, the riparian areas, so it's just changing how we work and having an influence on the questions we ask. And I think, maybe that makes the work less publishable, but who cares? Because for me, this is about serving community in a greater why, and we are creating venues for ourselves to be able to communicate this very important work, not just for Indigenous communities, but for non-Indigenous communities as well. So, Cook's Gem, thank you so much.
Thank you. That was an incredible presentation and deeply inspiring of how we should consider more of a relational ethic about how we conceive and think about invasive species. So thank you, Meadow. It was an amazing presentation. So we have a couple questions. The first one is a long series of questions. So if you can't get to all of the questions, just choose one out of this. It is, humans are causing these invasions of new species into ecological communities. How are ecological, economic, or political systems that manage human interaction with our ecosystems becoming more visible as methods of preventing, mitigating, or removing/adapting invasive species? Are there voluntary guidelines or binding regulations for governments at any levels that advise how to work with Indigenous peoples to reduce impacts from invasive species? What failed or successful models for Indigenous peoples' diplomacy or encouragement of cooperation in transboundary management of invasive species are available for those learning about colonial public policy today? That's a lot of questions. Good questions.
I think I'm just going to tend to the beginning part of that, which is, I think that it's a colonial notion to kind of think like humans are causing all these bad things in the ecosystem. And because I actually think that this has led to a huge issue with the conservation movement in particular, where we're trying to protect things from people, which is actually causing a disconnection with land. And that's like a whole other presentation. But I think like the reality is that we move around on the planet. And very few people are willingly bringing things with them. Some are, and there are regulations to try and tend to those things. And by and large, they're becoming better and better as we go. But I think that, this is about continuing to have discussions with the powers that be about how we manage the relationships with land, with people. So instead of saying keep them out of here because they might be introducing invasive species, it's like teach them or provide the infrastructure for them to clean off before they're coming into that space, understanding like that they're, and communicating it in an indigenized way. Like, you're entering my house, take your shoes off first, right? Like, there are ways to create this messaging in a way that people really understand and are respectful, and then also honor the reciprocity piece of this. And maybe it is, if you're coming into enjoy something for its aesthetic beauty, that you have to pull an invasive plant while you're in there, or you have to bring a black cap raspberry cane over to the ground and put some dirt over it. Like, just, I think it's just about, we need to be encouraging relationship and teaching people about that instead of sort of kind of protecting and keeping people out.
Yeah, great answer. Okay, so we have another question. There's lots of comments coming into the Q&A section. If anyone else has other questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We have one from Sammy Matsaw, and it says, not surprising, purity from actors of savior complex are trying to drive Indigenous management without teachings, and it's not helpful. How do Indigenous natural resource organizations bring them into what you shared today? Do you have a simple teaching to share driving your ideas of invasive native species interactions towards relationality?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that has happened in, because I'm sharing these ideas in different, like in, Western scientific settings, and my area, is largely dominated by men, and I always, joke that I'm part of the cowboy profession, and so this was what was also making me very nervous about sharing these kinds of and talking about relationality and stuff. Like, I was very worried about that. But what was very interesting is when I first talked about this in a conventional setting at the Canadian Weed Science Society conference in where I can't remember where we were, but at the end of my presentation, a friend took a picture of the cowboys lined up to talk to me, and many of them who actually had their hats in their hands, and this is just kind of the funny sort of part of this, who were like talking to me with tears in their eyes that I had spoken the things in their heads and on their hearts while they have worked for the last 30 years. So this is like a truth that anyone, I think, that is working in these spaces can see and cannot find their way out of. And so this is where I really do feel like we are presenting an opportunity to find our way into the nuance and into that conversation. So I don't have a specific, teaching other than that. It just seems like it's a truth that has been carried by so many. I just have been able to speak it and been shocked by the support and now being invited into more of these spaces where before the invasive species dogma was dominating the conferences. So there's the winds of change are upon us, and I think this is allowing more work with Indigenous communities, especially up here, where the question, instead of automatically imposing what's going to happen, like we're coming into your lands because we're getting rid of this thing and there's nothing you can do about it, is saying, what would you, what do you think we should do? What, like, how should this look? Like, it's changing the conversation, and there are champions within some of these levels of government, that are helping to carry that torch, and our allies have been essential in that as well.
So speaking of allies, Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who was our keynote speaker today, just asked a really good question. She asks, as an Indigenous scientist who works with non-Indigenous scientists, how do you navigate not sharing sacred knowledge or knowledge that was shared with you by elders, especially since it is often co-opted in this field? Referencing permaculture, among other Indigenous ways of knowing that have been co-opted in restoration work.
Well, it's entirely dependent on the community that I'm working with, and my work is largely Coast Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw communities, as well as Nlaka'pamux and Secwepemc communities. All the protocols are different, and there are things that we work on and do that we don't share. This is just how we navigate it. And I have had a number of breakups, with allied researchers who do not want to respect that or understand it. Whereas I have others where, we're working on site on something quite sensitive right now, where that researcher just leaves the space for, as soon as we're doing something. So, we're all kind of figuring this out as we go. But I think for me, maintaining relationships with the communities I work with is number one. And I think the reason I've been able to have the relationships I do is because we have a very clear discussion about this, and every knowledge keeper I work with, we have a clear discussion about this and what is shareable and what isn't, and that is a privilege, and that is why, we're in a new realm of extraction right now, where we have funding agencies that are incentivizing inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, which is which is causing, in my mind, a really significant problem. And I think that all of that is going to become very evident as what Dr. Hernandez just brought up starts to happen, right? And that is where, like, so many communities now that I have relationships with are like, we want to work on this. Is this your area? I'm like, no, but here's the person that you should be working with to protect that. We have our, so this is, we're in a new phase and navigating the best we can, but knowing those protocols and tending to those relationships is how we stay, we keep working in a good way.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your knowledge, all of the beautiful wisdom that you shared, and the labors that you took to deliver this presentation and create it for the summit. I appreciate you and the good work that you do. We're going to be moving to the next session in the next 5 minutes or so. So folks, get some more water. Water's life, right? So I'm always encouraging people to do that. Take a break and get ready for the last session of the day. If you are moving on to one of the Indigenous writing groups after this session is completed, just hang tight, because I have to get off here to start that, and we have to make sure that it's going to work. So just hang tight. We'll be back in about 4 minutes. And yeah, thank you again, Dr. Grenz. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Hooks Gem.